Why your church is stuck at 100, and it's probably not even what you think. Let me ask you a question. Why do so many churches get stuck around 75 or 100 people? Not declining, not dying, just stuck. The pastor works harder, the church prays longer, programs improve, yet growth seems to hit an invisible ceiling. I know that frustration because I've lived it. Years ago, my wife and I started a multicultural church in New England. When we started, there were five people. Five. We met in a rented storefront, not an impressive facility, no large staff, no large budget, no budget really, just a vision, a calling, and a handful of people willing to believe God with us for something greater. Over time, that church grew to more than 500 people. And along the journey, we moved from the rented storefront to purchasing one of the most historic church facilities in Newport, Rhode Island. But here's what most people don't understand. The greatest challenge wasn't starting the church, and the greatest challenge wasn't attracting people. The greatest challenges were learning how to lead through growth barriers. Because every season of growth requires a different level of leadership. And every time we reached a new level, what got us there wouldn't get us to the next level. If your church is stuck around 50 or 75, 100, or even 125 people, what I'm about to share with you may completely change how you think about church growth. Welcome. My name is Stephen Robinson, and for years I served as the senior pastor of that multicultural church in New England. The lessons learned through that journey eventually became the foundations for a book, which I authored called Mega Small Church. In that book, I shared the story how God led us from a rented storefront with five people to a thriving congregation of more than 500, and ultimately into one of Newport's most historic church facilities. But the book really isn't about buildings. It's about leadership. It's about growth barriers. It's about mistakes. It's about lessons learned. It's about discovering what it actually takes to lead a church through seasons of growth and transition. Now, let me say something important. There are many church growth organizations, consultants, and resources available today. And many of them provide valuable insight based upon research and surveys, data, and best practices. And those things matter. I've learned from them, I use them. But there's something different about learning from someone who's actually navigated the journey. Someone who stood in front of a congregation week after week for years, someone who has carried the weight of leadership, someone who's made mistakes, someone who's experienced growth barriers firsthand, someone who built a thriving multicultural church in one of the most difficult ministry environments in America. That's the perspective I bring. Because what I'm sharing isn't simple theory, it's battle tested experience. There are many people who can tell you what the data says. Few can tell you what it feels like to stand in front of a congregation every week, carrying the weight of leadership, navigating through growth barriers, and building a thriving multicultural church in New England from 5 to more than 500. That's the perspective that I bring. The biggest myth I see pastors believe is this: if I preach better, my church will grow. Now, let me be clear. Preaching matters, sound doctrine matters, biblical teaching matters, but I've known incredible communicators who churches remain stuck and small and they don't grow for 20 years. And I know average communicators who lead growing, expanding churches. Why? Because growth barriers are really preaching barriers. More often, they are leadership barriers, systems barriers, capacity barriers. The problem isn't what happens for 1 hour on Sunday. The problem is what happens during the other 167 hours of the week. Growth barriers are really preaching barriers, they're leadership barriers. When a church is 30 or 40 or 50, the pastor can touch almost everything. You know everybody, I've been there. You solve every problem, you make every decision, you oversee every ministry. And honestly, at that size, it works. But somewhere between 75 and 125 people, the complexity changes. The church has outgrown the leadership model that got it there. The issue is no longer attendance. The issue is capacity. Can new people connect? Can leaders be developed? Can ministry continue without the pastor being involved in everything? Can the organization absorb growth? See, those questions determine whether growth continues. Most churches don't stop growing because they lack people. They stop growing because they lack capacity. One of the hardest lessons that I've learned was realizing that I had become the bottleneck. Not intentionally, not because I wanted control, but because the church had grown beyond a one-person leadership model. Every growing church reaches a moment when the pastor must make a choice. Will I continue doing ministry, or will I develop leaders who can do ministry? Those are two very different things, because leadership is not about doing more. Leadership is about multiplying yourself through others. The very skills that help you reach 50 or 100 may be the skills preventing you from reaching 200. Think about that. One of the greatest discoveries I made during our journey was this: growth doesn't solve problems. Growth reveals problems. If leadership is weak, growth reveals it. If systems are weak, growth reveals that. If communication is weak, guess what? Growth reveals it. If volunteer development is weak, growth reveals it. Growth is a magnifying glass. It exposes what already exists beneath the structure. That's why every growth barrier is a gift, because barriers reveal what must change before the next season. Remember, growth doesn't create problems. Growth reveals problems. Several years ago, I started asking a simple question. Why are small churches like me, and perhaps like you, fascinated with mega churches? So I began researching church demographics across America. What I discovered shocked me. More than 94% of all churches in America have fewer than 500 people, 94%. And roughly 75% of all churches have fewer than 100. Think about that for a moment. The overwhelming majority of churches in America are not mega churches, they're small churches. Yet so much of the conversation about church growth revolves around the experiences of less than the 5%. The conferences, the books, the podcasts, the leadership language, the ministry models. Much of it was built around churches that represents only a tiny fractions of churches in America. And I remember attending a large church conference and feeling frustrated, not because the content wasn't good, it was. Not because the leaders weren't gifted, they were, but the language didn't fit my reality. The challenges they were discussing weren't the challenges I was facing. The systems that they were describing didn't apply to where our church was. Like your church director with 200 kids in a child's wing. We didn't even have 200 people at the time. I knew that didn't apply to us. And I began wondering, where's the conversation for the other 94% like me? Where's the framework for pastors trying to break through 50 or 75 people or 100 people or 200 or 300 people? Where is the conversations for churches that are making a tremendous impact in their communities, but don't have thousands of people attending every weekend? As I prayed about it, I sensed the Holy Spirit impressing upon me two words: mega, small. At first, it sounded like a contradiction. Mega, small. How can something be both? But the more I prayed about it, the more I realized what God was showing me. A church can be small in size and still have a mega impact. A church can still be small in attendance and still transform a city. A church can be small numerically and still have enormous kingdom influence. Because God's measure of impact isn't always attendance, it's influence, it's transformation, it's discipleship, it's kingdom effectiveness. And that's when I realized the problem wasn't that churches were small. The problem was that too many small churches were trying to become someone else instead of becoming the healthiest version of who God called them to be. Mega small became my answer to that challenge. a framework, a language, a movement designed specifically to help pastors and churches navigate through growth barriers that most churches actually face. Not the barriers of the 5%ers, the barriers of the 94%, the barriers between 50 and 100, 100 and 200, 200 and 300, and beyond, because I believe every church, regardless of size, can have a mega impact. So let me leave you with one question. If 50 people showed up at your church this Sunday, what would break? Would your follow-up process break? Would your volunteer system break? Would your communication break? Would your leadership break? Because whatever would break first is probably revealing your next growth barrier. If you're leading a church that's stuck at 50 or 75, 100 or 150 people, I want to encourage you. Being stuck doesn't mean you're failing. It may simply mean you reached a leadership threshold. And every threshold requires a different level of leadership. On this channel, we're going to talk about church growth barriers, leadership transition and pipelines, volunteerism, staff development, organizational alignment, and the mega small framework. And practical lessons learned from building a multicultural church from 5 people in a storefront to more than 500 people in one of America's most challenging ministry environments. If this video was helpful, subscribe to the channel and in the comments tell me, what is the biggest challenge your church is facing right now? And remember, not theory, not trends, battle-tested leadership from the front lines of church growth. I'm Stephen Robinson, author of Mega Small Church, and I'll see you in the next video. God bless you.